Breaking news tonight, the vice mayor of Coral Springs, Nancy Metayer Bowen, was found dead in her home.
I didn't hear anything unusual, and then suddenly, everything was already over. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, the situation inside that home had already reached a point no one could reverse. What investigators would uncover in the hours that followed would not just raise questions, it would reshape the entire direction of the case. Before we go further, this case involves serious and unsettling events. Viewer discretion is advised. This is Fatal Files, where we break down real cases with verified details and a focus on what others often miss. In the previous breakdown, we covered the initial discovery and the immediate response. But what happened next raises even more questions. Because once the scene was secured and the first statements were taken, investigators began to notice details that didn't quite fit together. At first glance, it seemed like a tragic and sudden incident inside a home. But as the timeline started to form, and as each piece of information was placed next to the next, a different picture began to emerge. One that suggested this was not as straightforward as it initially appeared. And that shift did not take long. Within a very short window, attention began to focus in a specific direction. Not because of speculation, but because of what the evidence was beginning to show, and how certain actions didn't align with what was being said. If you're here for deeper, verified breakdowns that go beyond headlines, subscribe now. This case only gets more complex from here. Because from this point forward, the investigation doesn't just follow what happened. It starts asking why. At the center of this case is Nancy Metayer Bowen, a vice mayor and a public figure known within her community, and her husband, Stephen Bowen. The incident came to light following a 911 call that brought emergency responders to the home. When authorities arrived, they were met with a situation that immediately raised concern. Inside, Nancy was found unresponsive, and it was clear that this was not a routine emergency. From the beginning, the circumstances stood out. There was no extended period where investigators considered multiple unrelated possibilities. Instead, the focus narrowed quickly. That decision wasn't based on assumption, but on early observations made at the scene and the initial interactions that followed. Stephen Bowen, as the only other person closely tied to the situation, became central to those early questions. His presence, his account of events, and the timing of everything he described were all examined closely. What stood out was not just what was said, but how it aligned with what investigators were seeing in real time. The timeline began to form almost immediately. And as it did, certain gaps and inconsistencies became harder to ignore. These weren't minor details. They were the kind of discrepancies that typically lead investigators to take a closer look at someone's version of events. In many cases, it can take days or even weeks for suspicion to focus in one direction. Here it happened much faster. That rapid shift didn't come from pressure or guesswork. It came from the early pieces of evidence and the behavior observed in those first critical moments. And from that point on, the investigation moved forward with a clearer sense of where to look next. As the initial response phase ended, investigators shifted their focus to reconstruction. The goal was no longer just to understand what had happened inside the home, but to establish a clear and verifiable timeline. Every movement, every statement, and every minute began to matter. The first step was to align Stephen Bowen's account with known events. He described how the situation unfolded, the sequence of actions he took, and the timing of when everything occurred. On the surface, the explanation appeared structured. But when investigators began placing those statements alongside physical observations, small inconsistencies started to surface. These were not dramatic contradictions. Instead, they were subtle differences. Timing that didn't fully match. Details that seemed slightly out of place. Individually, they might not have raised immediate alarm. But taken together, they formed a pattern that investigators could not ignore. Attention also turned to behavior. Investigators are trained to observe not just what a person says, but how they say it and how they act before and after a critical event. In this case, certain actions stood out. The sequence of decisions, the pacing of responses, and the overall demeanor began to draw closer scrutiny. At the same time, the physical scene itself provided its own set of clues. Items were documented, positions noted, and conditions carefully recorded. These details served as an independent reference point, one that could either support or challenge the statements being given. As both sides of the investigation developed, the gap between narrative and evidence became more defined. It was no longer just about confirming a version of events. It was about identifying where that version no longer held up under examination. By this stage, the investigation had clearly moved beyond initial uncertainty. The focus was sharpening, guided by both observation and analysis. Each new detail added weight to the emerging picture. Investigators weren't just looking at what happened. They were starting to question why. The investigation reached a critical point when multiple strands of evidence began to align. What had previously been a collection of observations and inconsistencies started to form a more cohesive structure. And with that shift came the introduction of details that carried significant legal weight. One of the most important elements was a reported admission connected to Stephen Bowen. Investigators documented information suggesting that he had made statements acknowledging involvement in the incident. This was not treated as a standalone conclusion, but as a piece of evidence that required careful verification and context. Statements like these are evaluated against physical findings and other known facts to determine their reliability and relevance. Alongside this, investigators examined the method believed to have been used during the incident. Evidence pointed toward the use of a modified device intended to reduce sound. This detail was significant not because of its construction, but because of what it suggested in terms of preparation. The presence of such a device can indicate planning, which is a key factor in how charges are ultimately determined. Physical evidence within the home continued to support the developing narrative. Items recovered at the scene, combined with forensic analysis, helped establish how events likely unfolded. Each piece contributed to a broader understanding, linking actions to outcomes in a way that could be presented clearly in a legal setting. Circumstantial evidence also played a role. Behavior before and after the incident, communication patterns, and the sequence of events all added context. While no single element stood alone as definitive proof, together they created a framework that was difficult to dismiss. Legally, this combination of evidence is crucial. Courts do not rely on isolated facts. They rely on how those facts connect, support each other, and withstand scrutiny. In this case, investigators were building that connection step by step. This stage marked a turning point. The investigation was no longer centered on possibilities. It was moving toward a structured case, supported by evidence that addressed both actions and intent. With key evidence identified, investigators began the process of formally building the case. This phase focused on organization, verification, and logical consistency. Every detail collected up to that point had to be placed within a clear and defensible framework. The timeline became the backbone of the investigation. Detectives worked to establish a precise sequence of events, using a combination of physical evidence, recorded data, and witness information. Each segment of time was examined to determine what could be confirmed and what required further clarification. Evidence correlation played a central role. Physical findings from the scene were compared against statements, while behavioral observations were evaluated alongside known timelines. This method allows investigators to identify where elements align and where discrepancies remain. The goal is not to force a conclusion, but to ensure that any conclusion reached is supported by multiple independent sources. Forensic analysis added another layer. Materials collected from the scene were processed to provide objective data. These results are critical because they are not influenced by interpretation in the same way that statements can be. Instead, they offer measurable information that can either support or challenge the existing narrative. Investigators also applied a structured approach to decision-making. Rather than focusing on a single theory, they tested multiple possibilities against the evidence. This process helps eliminate alternatives and strengthens the validity of the final conclusion. It is a method built on consistency, not assumption. Understanding how investigators think is key to understanding the case itself. Each step is guided by procedure, and each conclusion must be justified by evidence. There is no reliance on instinct alone. Everything must be documented, reviewed, and capable of standing up in court. As this process continued, the case began to take a more defined shape. The connections between events, actions, and outcomes were becoming clearer. But even as the structure strengthened, one detail remained unresolved. At this point, it seemed like the case was coming together, but one detail still didn't fully add up. As the investigation moved forward, attention turned to the broader context surrounding the individuals involved. Understanding a case like this requires more than just examining physical evidence. It also involves looking at the environment, the relationship, and the circumstances leading up to the incident. Nancy Metayer Bowen was known publicly as a vice mayor, actively involved in her community and local government. Her role placed her in a position of visibility and responsibility, which meant that much of her public life was documented and observed. Colleagues and community members viewed her as engaged and committed to her work. At the same time, investigators began examining the private side of her life, particularly her relationship with Stephen Bowen. Like many relationships, much of what occurred behind closed doors was not visible to the public. However, certain aspects could still be evaluated through available records, communication patterns, and verified interactions. Marriage dynamics are often complex, and investigators approach them carefully. In this case, the focus was not on drawing conclusions, but on identifying any factors that could provide context. This included looking at shared responsibilities, daily routines, and any documented changes in behavior over time. Stress factors were also considered, but only where supported by evidence. These can include financial pressures, professional demands, or personal challenges. When verified, such factors can help explain shifts in behavior or decision-making, but they are never used in isolation to determine motive. It is important to maintain a neutral perspective in this phase. The goal is not to assign meaning beyond what the evidence supports, but to understand the setting in which events occurred. By building this context, investigators can better interpret actions and timelines without relying on assumption. Ultimately, this stage of the investigation was about adding depth. Not to dramatize the situation, but to ensure that every relevant aspect of the case was considered within a clear and factual framework. As the investigation reached a point where evidence and analysis aligned, law enforcement moved forward with formal action. Stephen Bowen was taken into custody, marking a significant transition from investigation to prosecution. An arrest in a case like this is based on probable cause. This means investigators and prosecutors believe there is sufficient evidence to support the claim that a crime has been committed and that the individual in custody is responsible. It does not determine guilt, but it does indicate that the case has reached a level where formal charges can be filed. In this instance, Stephen Bowen was charged with first-degree murder and evidence tampering. First-degree murder is a serious charge that typically involves the element of intent or premeditation. In simple terms, it means that prosecutors believe the act was not accidental, but carried out with a level of planning or deliberate action. The second charge, evidence tampering, refers to actions taken to alter, hide, or interfere with evidence related to the case. This can include attempts to change the scene, dispose of items, or otherwise impact the investigation. It is a separate offense, but one that often strengthens the overall case by suggesting awareness of wrongdoing. Following the arrest, Stephen Bowen was held without bond. This decision is generally made when a court determines that releasing the individual could pose a risk, whether in terms of public safety or the possibility of not appearing for future proceedings. At this stage, the case formally entered the legal system, where the focus would shift toward courtroom proceedings and the evaluation of evidence under judicial review. As the case moved into the courtroom phase, the focus shifted from investigation to legal interpretation. This stage is where evidence is formally presented, challenged, and evaluated under judicial standards. Each side approaches the case with a specific objective, guided by legal strategy rather than investigative theory. One of the early points of attention was the status of the defense. Questions surrounding legal representation introduced an element of uncertainty. In situations like this, the role of a defense attorney is critical. Their responsibility is to examine the evidence, challenge inconsistencies, and ensure that the rights of the accused are fully protected throughout the process. On the other side, prosecutors work to present a clear and structured case. Their goal is to demonstrate that the evidence supports the charges beyond a reasonable doubt. This involves organizing findings from the investigation into a logical sequence that can be understood and evaluated in court. The difference in strategy between the two sides is fundamental. The prosecution builds a narrative supported by evidence, aiming to establish intent and responsibility. The defense, in contrast, focuses on identifying gaps, questioning reliability, and introducing alternative interpretations where possible. Court proceedings during this phase often involve preliminary hearings, where key aspects of the case are reviewed. These hearings help determine how the case will move forward, what evidence will be admissible, and what arguments each side is likely to present. Throughout this process, the emphasis remains on procedure and fairness. Every claim must be supported, and every challenge must be addressed within the framework of the law. As the case progressed, both sides continued to prepare for the next stages, where the full weight of the evidence would be tested in detail. As it stands, the case remains a developing situation, with key elements already established and others still awaiting further clarity. The investigation has produced a structured set of findings, and the legal process has begun to take shape, but the final outcome depends on how the evidence is ultimately presented and evaluated in court. What is known at this point is based on documented evidence, investigative work, and formal charges. These elements provide a foundation, but they do not answer every question. There are still aspects of the timeline, intent, and sequence of decisions that require full examination within the legal system. Cases like this often extend over time, moving through multiple stages before reaching a conclusion. Each stage brings new information, whether through court proceedings, legal arguments, or additional findings. That ongoing development is a key part of understanding the full scope of the case. The significance of this case goes beyond the individuals directly involved. It highlights how investigations are conducted, how evidence is evaluated, and how the legal system works to reach a resolution based on established standards. It also reflects the broader impact such events can have on a community, especially when a public figure is involved. If you want updates as this case develops, subscribe. We follow these cases all the way through, not just the headlines. Based on everything we've covered, what do you think really happened here? The answer to that question will ultimately be shaped by the evidence, the arguments presented, and the decisions made as the case continues to move forward.